Hello everyone, and welcome to or back to the channel. I'm Origin Gaming, and this is the beginning of a new series I'm calling My Good Christian Minecraft World. My goal with this series is going to be to cover the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation, one book at a time. For each book, I'll be providing summaries, highlighting key themes, and giving my own commentary along the way. As for why I'm doing all of this, to the background of playing hardcore survival Minecraft, the answer is that while my work and education is in the fields of ministry and theology, I've always enjoyed playing video games and wanted a way to bring those two things together. Anyways, with that bit of introduction out of the way, let's get right into the creation stories of Genesis 1 and 2. Notice that I did say stories plural. The creation account that runs from Genesis 1:1 until chapter 2 verse 3 is more of a grand cosmological story about the whole of creation. From verses 4 and onward tells a different story that focuses specifically on humanity and humanity's fall later than in chapter 3. But let's first focus on chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The stage is set, and the process of creation has begun. The earth is initially formless, void, or chaotic. But on the face of this darkness and void is the Spirit, or breath of God. These first few verses tell us that we're already in the midst of the act of creation. Things are currently chaotic, but the rest of the chapter will narrate how God makes order out of that chaos. On day 1, God separates the light from the darkness, creating day and night. On day 2, God separates the sky, the heavens, from the earth. On day 3, God forms the land and the vegetation. On day 4, the sun, moon, and stars. On day 5, the creatures of the sea, and on day 6, the creatures of the land, ultimately culminating in the creation of humanity. Many people spend a lot of time arguing about whether or not we're meant to interpret this literally, as in, was the earth and the whole of the cosmos created in only 6 days? Regardless of whether or not you favor a metaphorical or a literal interpretation of this passage, I think the argument distracts us from what the real theological takeaway is meant to be. The cosmology, or understanding of the world and the cosmos around us that we see in Genesis 1, reflects a lot of other ancient Near Eastern cosmologies and creation stories, such as the Enuma Elish from Babylonian mythology. However, the core difference between the creation story in Genesis and these other creation stories is that these other creation stories, the world is often created out of spite or out of accident, as a consequence of warring between multiple gods. In Genesis, one God, the God, creates the whole world and the whole cosmos. That is the key takeaway from Genesis chapter 1. And then after creating the whole world, God gives dominion of the earth to humanity, said to be made in God's own image. Moving on to Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 4, we move back in the timeline to before the creation of humanity or even the vegetation of the land. This is why I say that Genesis chapter 2 is a second creation story, rather than a continuation of chapter 1. It's a different perspective and a different story, focusing specifically on humanity itself. God creates Adam from the dust, and then tasks Adam with keeping the Garden of Eden, a place that has everything Adam needs, including the tree of life, but it also has a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God warns Adam not to eat from that tree, as the day that he does, he will surely die. God then acknowledges Adam's loneliness, and then brings before Adam all of the animals to see if any of them can be an adequate companion for Adam. Adam gives all of them names, but none of them can truly be a companion to him. God then makes woman out of Adam's Selah, often translated as rib, but more literally speaking, the Hebrew word means side. I think the translation of side is appropriate here, because the translation of rib makes the connotation that woman comes from a small part of man, rather than translating it as side, which implies that the two make up equal halves of the whole of humanity. After the creation of Eve, who has not actually been named yet in chapter 2, the two get married and become one flesh. Moving on to Genesis chapter 3, where we see the fall of humanity. The serpent, who is said to be craftier than any of the other beasts of the land, tempts the woman, asking her if she's really allowed to not eat from any of the trees in the garden. He responds, saying that she can eat from any of the trees in the garden, except for the tree in the center of the garden, that she says she can neither touch or eat from, lest she will die. The serpent responds and tells the woman that what will actually happen is that she will gain the knowledge of good and evil if she eats from the tree, and that she will become like God. In their pride and their desire to become like gods themselves, Adam and Eve eat from the fruit of the tree, hoping to gain its knowledge. In a way, the serpent did not lie in order to deceive them. He merely omitted part of the truth. Their eyes were opened to good and evil, and they suddenly felt shame for the first time. In their loss of innocence, they sought to hide their nakedness from God. When God confronts them, Adam first blames his wife, and then his wife blames the serpent. God punishes all three of them for their roles within this sin, but God also speaks of a future time in which an offspring of the woman will bruise the head of the snake, while the snake bruises the heel of the offspring. Because Adam and Eve have now sinned, God kicks them out of the Garden of Eden. And the stated reason as to why is to keep Adam and Eve from eating from the tree of life. Now, there are multiple ways to interpret this, but the way that I have always taken it is that God is actually being merciful in choosing to remove them from the garden. If they were to eat from the tree of life, now being sinful, then they would live forever in their sin, doing infinite harm to themselves and to others. In this way, removing them from the garden is actually the first step in God's plan for ultimate salvation. Moving on to chapter 4, Cain and Abel are both born. Cain becomes a worker of the land, and Abel a tender of sheep. They both give a sacrifice to the Lord, but the Lord prefers Abel's sacrifice over Cain's. This angers Cain, and in his jealousy, he murders his brother Abel. After the loss of Abel, God provides another son for Adam and Eve, named Seth. Chapter 5 recounts the generations from Adam down to Noah, through the lineage of Seth. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 tell the story of Noah and the great flood. Rather than getting too bogged down in the individual details of this story, I just want to make a couple of overarching points. Like the basic framework of the cosmology that we see in Genesis chapter 1, the story of the flood is not one that is unique to Genesis alone. Most ancient Near Eastern societies had some sort of flood narrative that was part of their self-identity. Because of this, I think the most important lessons to be gleaned from the flood narrative in Genesis can be seen in how it differs from those other ancient Near Eastern stories. In this instance, the core difference between the story in Genesis and many of the other stories is that in Genesis, the reason God floods the earth is because of the wickedness of humanity. In many of the other flood stories, the gods flood the earth either because of their warring amongst themselves, their petty differences, their jealousy, or even in one instance simply because humans are too loud and annoying. The lesson of the story is clear. God desires justice, and justice must be done, but God also desires mercy, which is why God ultimately relents with the flood and promises to never do such a thing on the earth again. After the story of Noah and the flood concludes, the next couple of chapters primarily consist of genealogies spanning from Noah down to Abram. But in the midst of these genealogies, there's one story that stands out: the story of the Tower of Babel. In chapter 11, verse 1, it said that the whole earth comes together and had one tongue. They planned to build a great tower that stretches up to the heavens to make a name for themselves. In response, God notes that this is only the beginning of what they might do if they continue to work together like this, and decides to disperse them, confusing their language and keeping them from working together on this common task. While this story and its placement in the greater text of Genesis can seem quite confusing, it actually acts as a summary of the same themes that have been taught throughout the book so far. If the pride of humanity is left unchecked, then humanity will go on to do abhorrent things. This is exactly why God cast humanity out of the garden and kept them from the tree of life. In the same way, the confusing of their speech, though it may seem at first like a punishment, is ultimately for their own good. Just as keeping humans from the tree of life when they are sinful is ultimately an act of mercy, as I mentioned earlier. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts, when the Holy Spirit falls on the church for the first time on the day of Pentecost and allows the speech of all people to be understood by one another again, it is the reversal and the redemption of this moment, which was a symptom of humanity's fall. Moving on to chapter 12 and to the call of Abram. God tells Abram to get up and to leave his homeland, the land of his father's house, and to go to the land of Canaan. And God promises to Abram that if he does this, he will make a great nation out of him, and that his descendants will rule this land. In the latter half of chapter 12, we see the rather odd story in which Abram lies to the Pharaoh of Egypt, telling him that his wife Sarai is actually his sister. He does this out of fear that the Pharaoh of Egypt would simply kill him and take Sarai to be his own wife. Pharaoh takes Sarai to be his wife and is then afflicted with plagues because of this, as Sarai was already married to Abram. Therefore, he was committing adultery. Because of the plagues, Pharaoh relents and lets Sarai and Abram go. When you look at this story on its own, it seems quite odd, especially to most modern readers. But this story serves two purposes. One within the immediate context of Genesis, and one within the greater biblical narrative. In the context of Genesis, this story shows us that Abram is flawed. Even though he did listen to God and got up from his homeland to go to the land that God had promised for him and his descendants, when Abram's expectations are not met in the time that he wants them, and he is forced to instead sojourn in Egypt, he tries to take things into his own hands in order to provide for himself. And as we will soon see, this is not the last time Abram makes that mistake. As for how this story fits into the greater biblical narrative, it actually foreshadows the story of Israel itself. Sarai here represents the people of Israel being given over to Egypt when they actually belong to God. God sending plagues, forcing Pharaoh to release Sarai, is a foreshadowing of God sending plagues to force Pharaoh to release the people of Israel in the story of Moses and the Exodus. In chapter 13, God reaffirms the promise that Abram's descendants will be numerous, comparing them to the number of grains of dust on the land. In chapter 14, Abram goes to rescue Lot, who is captured in a war among various city-states, including Sodom and Gomorrah. In chapter 15, God goes beyond simply promising to give Abram descendants, and makes a true covenant with him, telling Abram that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. When Abram asks for proof that this will indeed be true, God tells Abram to collect some animals and to cut them in half. This may seem like a strange ritual to us now, but in the ancient Near East, this would have been understood as the proper way to seal a covenant or contract. In fact, this sort of ritual is why we have the phrase in English, to cut a deal. Normally, what would happen is that when you cut the animals in half, both parties would walk through the middle of the severed pieces of the carcass to acknowledge they both took responsibility for this deal. But it is important to note that in this case, Abram does not walk between the pieces. Only the presence of God, represented by the flame, passes through. In this way, God is promising to uphold the covenant to Abram, even if Abram does not uphold his end of the bargain. In the very next chapter, chapter 16, Abram and Sarai finally have enough waiting on God and attempt to take things into their own hands. Abram sleeps with Hagar, one of Sarai's slaves, and Hagar gets pregnant with Abram's child. Even though Sarai initially encouraged Abram to sleep with Hagar, Sarai is now upset and banishes Hagar into the wilderness. While fleeing from Sarai and Abram, an angel of the Lord meets with Hagar and asks Hagar to return to them. Hagar listens to the angel of the Lord and returns to Abram and Sarai. She names God El Roi, meaning the God who sees, and names her son Ishmael, meaning God hears. In chapter 17, God appears to Abram again to make another covenant. The covenant, for the most part, overlaps with the first covenant made in chapter 15, except it's a little bit more specific in terms of giving Abram the actual name of his son to be, Isaac, and telling Abram that his descendants will have to be circumcised as a symbol of the covenant between them and God. God also renames Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. At the beginning of chapter 18, 3 men who appeared to just be simple travelers at first arrive at Abraham and Sarah's camp. They show these men hospitality, and in return, they tell them that come this time next year, Sarah will be with child. But Sarah laughs at this idea because she believes she is too old to give birth. But the messenger responds by saying that nothing is impossible for God. The latter half of chapter 18 and the whole of chapter 19 tell the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, how Abraham attempts to persuade God not to destroy the cities, but ultimately God does anyway because their wickedness is found to be too great. This story repeats similar themes to that of the flood story with Noah. In chapter 20, Abraham and Sarah travel to a new region and meet the king Abimelech. Abraham repeats the same mistake he did with the Pharaoh in Egypt and pretends that Sarah is his sister. However, unlike the story with Pharaoh in Egypt, Abimelech is warned as to what is going on in a dream, and he willingly gives back Sarah without being punished first. In chapter 21, Sarah finally conceives and gives birth to their son, Isaac. Not wanting Abraham's other son, Ishmael, to get any of the inheritance, Sarah asks Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away into the wilderness. Abraham is upset about this for the sake of his son Ishmael, but God tells Abraham to do as Sarah says, promising that there will also be a nation from Ishmael's descendants, as Ishmael is also an heir to Abraham. As Hagar was found desperate in the wilderness, she cried out to God, who answered her prayer, bringing forth a spring of water in the wilderness, so that they did not die of thirst. In chapter 22, we find the infamous story of the binding of Isaac. Here, God asks Abraham to bring Isaac up to the mountaintop and sacrifice him, even though God did not intend for Abraham to actually harm Isaac in any way. Many readers still struggle with this passage, as even suggesting that Abraham would have to sacrifice his own beloved son seems incredibly harsh. Now, from the perspective of the New Testament, we can also say that this text foreshadows the coming sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But even still, this is a difficult text to grapple with, and I don't want to simply explain it away easily. I believe that texts like this one are meant to challenge us, and that we are actually meant to wrestle with them. More on that in a minute. Moving on to chapter 23. Sarah dies, and Abraham buries her in the land of Canaan. In chapter 24, Abraham is also approaching death, so he sends a servant back to his homeland of Mesopotamia in hopes of finding someone to marry his son Isaac. God guides the servant to meet Rebekah at a well, who turns out to be a suitable match. Rebekah also happens to be Isaac's cousin, but that was pretty commonplace back then. After Rebekah comes back with the servant and meets Isaac, the two get married, and this comforts Isaac, as he is still mourning the loss of his mother. In chapter 25, Abraham dies at peace in his old age, and passes on all his belongings to his son Isaac. Later in the chapter, Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. God tells Rebekah, contrary to the normal order of things at the time, that Jacob, the younger son, will be the one to receive the inheritance. At the end of the chapter, Esau ends up selling his birthright to Jacob over a bowl of stew, because he believes he was so hungry he was about to starve to death. In chapter 26, God speaks to Isaac and warns him not to go down to Egypt. Isaac goes to make a deal with King Abimelech to stay in his land. In chapter 27, we find that Isaac is getting old and is approaching death, so he wishes to bless his firstborn son, Esau. But his eyes are no longer good, and he can't see very well. So Rebekah and Jacob form a plot to trick Isaac into blessing Jacob rather than Esau. The plot succeeds, and Jacob is able to receive the blessing from his father, Isaac. But this is the final straw that breaks the relationship between Esau and Jacob that was already quite thin. Not wanting to kill his brother while his father was still alive, Esau promises that after his father's death, he will kill Jacob. In chapter 28, both Jacob and Esau are sent off to find wives. Esau ends up marrying a woman who is a descendant of Ishmael, and Jacob goes to a place known as Luz, and he receives a vision from God in which the promises that God made to Abraham are repeated to Jacob. He gives glory to God for the sake of this vision, and decides to rename the place Bethel, which means house of God. In chapter 29, Jacob, still seeking to find a wife, meets Laban, who has two daughters, the older named Leah and the younger named Rachel. Jacob falls in love at first sight with Rachel, believing her to be beautiful, but Laban also wants to get Leah married off. Laban ends up tricking Jacob into sleeping with Leah when he believes he's sleeping with Rachel. Jacob ends up marrying both Leah and Rachel, but he prefers Rachel. God sees the plight of Leah and takes pity on her, opening her womb so that she can bear children, while keeping Rachel's shut. Leah gives birth to 4 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. This leads to a competition between the 2 sisters in chapter 30 as to who can provide more sons to Jacob. Rachel is still barren, so she gives over her servant Bilhah to Jacob to have babies on her behalf. Jacob ends up having 2 sons with Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali. In response, Leah gives over her servant, Zilpah, who has 2 more sons, Gad and Asher. Later on, Leah bears 2 final sons for Jacob, Issachar and Zebulun. She also has a daughter named Dinah. Finally, after all of that, Rachel will have her own son named Joseph. Rachel will have a final son named Benjamin, but we'll get to that in a few chapters. After working for Laban for many years and the birth of all of these children, Jacob decides it's time to go off on his own. Laban is initially upset by this and feels betrayed, but eventually him and Jacob work it out. In chapter 32, Jacob finds out that Esau is coming to meet with him with a group of 400 men. And Jacob is scared because he believes that Esau intends to kill him and his whole household. Jacob splits his house into 2 camps so that if one of them is attacked, the other one will be able to escape. And he prepares a gift to send to Esau, hoping that that will stay his wrath. That night, Jacob wrestles with a mysterious man. At daybreak, after winning the wrestling match, Jacob asks the man to bless him. The mysterious figure renames Jacob, giving him the name Israel, which means one who wrestles with God. Names carry a lot of meaning, especially in the particular culture and historical context in which this book is written. Giving the name Israel to Jacob, and ultimately to the whole people of God. This story can teach us an important lesson about how we are meant to interact with God. I do not believe that we are meant to have a faith that exists on blind trust alone, but to have a faith that is built on bringing our doubts and our questions to God, or, in another way, to wrestle with God. In chapter 33, Jacob finally comes face to face with Esau, and he believes that this could end violently. But instead, Esau runs to him and embraces him, and the 2 finally reconcile. In chapter 34, a man named Shechem defiles the daughter of Leah, named Dinah. Jacob says that if Shechem wants to marry his daughter, then he will have to get circumcised, along with their whole household. While all the men of their household are recovering from the circumcision, Dinah's 2 brothers, Simeon and Levi, killed all the males of Shechem's household. In chapter 35, God once again blesses Jacob and reaffirms his new name of Israel, as he still was going by Jacob. Later on in the chapter, we see that Rachel dies in childbirth, giving birth to her second and final son, Benjamin. In the very end of the chapter, we see that Isaac also dies and is buried by his 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, finally reconciled. Chapter 36 tells us the genealogy of Esau, and in that way, the origin of the land of Edom. Chapter 37 is the beginning of the 3rd and final act of the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph. Now, Joseph is the older of the 2 sons of Rachel, and Joseph is said to have been Israel, or Jacob's, favorite son. Israel shows this favoritism by giving him a long, colorful robe. Now, Joseph's many brothers envied him because he was his father's favorite. Additionally, Joseph had multiple dreams in which he said he saw visions of his brothers bowing down before him, which only made them hate him even more. Eventually, his brothers got so fed up with Joseph that they conspired against him, wondering if they should kill him. But they decided there would be no money in that, so they instead sold him into slavery, where he would eventually end up in the service of Potiphar, a captain in the guard of Pharaoh. Chapter 38 tells an odd story about Judah and how he tries to marry off 2 of his sons to the same woman, Tamar. But both of them die, and in the end, Judah himself ends up sleeping with Tamar and having 2 sons with her. Chapter 39 returns to the story of Joseph. Joseph becomes a servant in Potiphar's house, but he slowly works his way up to the point where he becomes the overseer of the whole household. This is until Potiphar's wife tries to get Joseph to sleep with her. Joseph refuses, but after time and time again of trying to do so, she eventually steals part of his garment. She uses this garment as evidence that Joseph tried to sleep with her and blames it on him, and that gets Joseph thrown into prison. But even when he is in prison, he still rises to be somewhat of an overseer within the prison, showing God's favor in his life, even in the darkest of times. While Joseph is in prison, he meets two other prisoners that have dreams that they want to have interpreted, and Joseph offers his services, saying that God gives the interpretations of dreams. The first dream is that of the cupbearer. In the cupbearer's dream, there's a vine with 3 different branches, and the grapes ripen quickly, and the cupbearer squeezes the grapes into the cup and gives it to the Pharaoh. Joseph interprets that the 3 branches represent 3 days, and after 3 days, Pharaoh will take the cupbearer out of prison and restore him to his services. Joseph asks the cupbearer to remember Joseph and to tell Pharaoh that Joseph is stuck in prison and has done nothing to earn his place there. The chief baker's dream was similar. He had 3 cake baskets on his head, and in the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked goods for the Pharaoh, but there were birds eating out of the basket on his head. Joseph responded and told him that the interpretation was this: the 3 baskets represent 3 days, just like for the cupbearer. But in this case, in 3 days, the Pharaoh will take the baker and he will hang him on the tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from him. Both of Joseph's interpretations end up coming true. But even though the cupbearer is restored to his former position, he forgets about Joseph and never puts in the good word for him. In chapter 41, we learn that 2 years have passed, and suddenly Pharaoh has a dream that he needs interpreted. The cupbearer finally remembers about Joseph, and he tells the Pharaoh about the Hebrew man that he met in prison who was able to interpret dreams. So the Pharaoh sends for him to get an interpretation. The Pharaoh's dream is this: he sees 7 cows that are plump and attractive, that came up from the Nile, and they feed on the reed grass. But then after that, there are 7 other cows that come up after them, poor, ugly, and thin, such as that he had never seen in all the land of Egypt. The thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But even after they had eaten them, no one would have known they had eaten, because they were still ugly and thin. Joseph does indeed have an interpretation for Pharaoh, but he makes sure to note that the interpretation does not come from his own power, but by the grace of God. Joseph's interpretation is this: the 7 good cows that are fat represent the next 7 years in Egypt's history, in which there will be plenty of food in the land. But the 7 ugly, thin cows that will come after represent 7 years of famine that will follow the next 7 prosperous years. So Joseph recommends that they must take time to store up as much surplus grain as possible, as to be ready for the time of famine. Pharaoh is pleased with this answer, so he puts Joseph in charge of managing the food supplies for the next 14 years. 7 years later, Joseph's prediction comes to pass, and a great famine falls over the land. But thankfully, Joseph had already filled huge storehouses of grain, and all the people of Egypt, and even beyond, came to Joseph to receive grain from him. In chapter 42, we see that in the land of Canaan, the famine is also there. And so Joseph's brothers are sent by Jacob, their father, to go to Egypt to attempt to buy some grain. When Joseph's brothers arrive, he recognizes them, but they do not recognize him. Despite how wicked they were to Joseph, Joseph shows them mercy and fills their bags with grain and even puts their money back in their satchels. But he requests to see Benjamin, the last of his 11 brothers, and the only other brother, from his mother, Rachel. But when the brothers return to Canaan and to their father Jacob, and tell them about the man who wants to meet Benjamin, Jacob says that Benjamin cannot go, because he cannot risk losing his last son from Rachel. In chapter 43, Jacob and his sons once again run out of food, and are forced to return to Egypt to get more. But Joseph's brothers must convince their father to allow Benjamin to come with them, because they told him that they could not return without bringing Benjamin, as that was Joseph's request. So the father relents and allows Benjamin to go. He also sends them with some more presents and with double the money from before, including the money that had been returned to them the first time. In chapter 44, Joseph tests his brothers. by sending them back once again with their money returned to them, with all the food they need, and this time with his own personal silver cup in the bag that belonged to Benjamin. Then Joseph sent one of his servants to go after the brothers and to act as if the cup had been stolen, saying that he would punish the one who stole the cup. When they all go through their bags and it is revealed that it is Benjamin's, the brothers go back to plead on Benjamin's behalf. In chapter 45, it finally gets to be too much for Joseph to keep up the act, and he professes that he is indeed their brother. They do not recognize or believe him at first, but Joseph explains what happened, and how even though they had sold him into slavery, this was all actually part of God's greater plan, so that they would not perish in the great famine to come. What they had meant for evil, God had meant for good. So Joseph sends all of his brothers back with plenty of supplies. They return to their father and tell him the good news that Joseph lives. This revives their father, and with this new spirit, he sets off towards Egypt to see his son before he dies. Chapter 46 gives an updated genealogy of the generations from Jacob down to the sons of Joseph. Chapter 46 also recounts the reunion in which Jacob returns to see Joseph in Egypt, where Jacob says that he can now die at peace because he has seen that his son Joseph is alive. In chapter 47, Jacob and his whole family settle in the land of Goshen, and they grow to be successful shepherds and farmers. At the end of chapter 47, we see that Jacob is near death, and so he calls his sons to him to give them a final blessing, and to request that they take his body to be buried in the land of his fathers. In chapter 48, Jacob blesses Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, but he gives the greater blessing to Ephraim, even though Ephraim is the younger of the two, repeating the same thing that happened between him and his brother Esau, where the younger received the greater blessing, contrary to the normal order of things at the time. In chapter 49, Jacob calls all of his sons together to bless them one final time before his death, though not all of the sons receive a positive blessing. Jacob says to Reuben, the firstborn, that because he is unstable, he will not have the typical preeminence of a firstborn. To the brothers Simeon and Levi, he says that they are too violent, and because of this they will be divided up and scattered. To his son Judah, Jacob says that his house will be like a lion, royal and strong. To Zebulun, he says that his people will dwell by the sea and work with ships. Issachar is said to be like a donkey, who will serve and do hard labor. To his son Dan, it is said that his house will judge the people. To his son Gad, it was said that he would be attacked by raiders. To Asher, that his food would be rich. To Naphtali, that his words would be beautiful. Joseph is said to be set apart from his brothers and to be greatly fruitful. Finally, Benjamin is ominously referred to as a ravenous wolf. After giving each of these blessings, Jacob breathes his last and is brought back to be buried in the land of his fathers, the land of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And at last we come to Genesis chapter 50, where Joseph and his brothers keep their promise to their father Jacob, and they bring him back to the land of Canaan to be buried, in a time of great mourning across the whole of Jacob's household and of Egypt. Eventually, Joseph returns and lives out the rest of his days in Egypt, till he dies in his old age and is buried there. His descendants will go on to live in Egypt, as all the descendants of the Hebrews will, for many generations, until the time of Moses. And with that, we have concluded the entire book of Genesis. I have plenty more I could say about Genesis, but I didn't want this episode to go any longer than around a half an hour. If you have any questions about anything that I covered in this video, or anything that I wasn't able to cover in this video, please feel free to ask them in the comments below, and I will answer them to the best of my abilities. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, and if you want to see more of these videos in the future, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss them. Thank you again so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.